We're live. Hi, everyone. I'm Vidya. I'm a volunteer with Fertility Matters, and I'm really happy to be here with you today to talk about fertility and diet. So today with us are Zainab Uraz and Alan Vu from A to Z Fertility. Thank you both for coming here today. Both Zainab and Alan are naturopathic doctors with a clinical focus on working with individuals and couples who are trying to conceive. So we're so lucky to have you today, and welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
We should mention that we are married. And I'm only saying that because we're sitting really close together without masks on, which is like the new reality these days. True. You have to like qualify why you're like sitting so close to somebody.
Yeah, you're in my book.
I love that. Yes, they're married and they're great. And they spend all of their time together in their home life and as well as work, and they still get along, which is amazing. But that's not what this Facebook Live is about. Today, we're going to talk about diet and fertility. So the fertility diet and applying the evidence around diet to you in your fertility journey. So yeah, do you want to just start us off, both of you, or one of you, whichever, you guys can figure that out, you're married, whichever one of you wants to start off, just talking about like the challenges that the patient population have with respect to diet and fertility, and just kick her off.
Yeah, for sure. Well, there's a couple of challenges, really. I think there's a lot of information out there. When you really look at the evidence, like while over the last 10 or 15 years, the evidence has really expanded tremendously in the field of fertility and diet in the scientific literature, there are specific challenges in how nutrition science is conducted, and it's hard to kind of apply those to the individual person. When media gets involved, we know that like often scientific reporting is like, little tidbits and misleading. So we really have to like dig down to the studies and look at, the quality of the studies and what they mean. And then, well, we have this like body of information in the scientific literature on diet and fertility, like that literature and information applies to each individual person differently. And so, it depends on who they are, what their underlying health conditions might be, what their own dietary preferences and patterns are. So we're always kind of, uniquely applying those things that we know to each individual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so today maybe what we can do is go over some what the research has shown about dietary patterns. And there's going to be a bit more of a focus on individuals with like eggs in uterus. Just for the sake of time, because it's a big topic, and also on general dietary patterns, and also maybe a little bit more specifically about certain food groups. So as Zainab was mentioning, it's a bit hard to do randomized controlled trials with diet, and let's say, Vidya, you eat this and only this, and then your neighbor eat this and only that kind of thing. But a group out of Harvard did do a study where they basically had come up with a diet that they thought would be best for fertility based on a lot of like previous our observational data and studies. And what they did was in an IVF clinic setting, they had women track what they ate and then looked at the results. And so basically they kind of compared like a basic healthy eating diet versus a Mediterranean diet versus the diet that they came up with, which they kind of dubbed the Pro-Fertility diet. And so what they noticed was actually the Pro-Fertility diet, when the women's food pattern matched the Pro-Fertility diet won the most. That was the one that gave them the most, like the best outcomes in terms of probability of live birth, which is actually a good thing to measure, right? Because in the end, that's really the end goal. So really the main, I guess, aspects then of the Pro-Fertility diet are that it is very similar to the Mediterranean diet. I think that there's a lot of focus on like whole foods, like low processed, that kind of thing, and also on a lot of healthy fats, right? So there's a little bit more emphasis on like olive oil and seafood and fish and intake. And
olive oil. You said olive oil already.
Yeah. And so there's a few other things that they found that was a little bit more that put women to a higher success category, or at least was associated with a higher success, and that was that the women consumed more folate or folic acid, B12, and vitamin D. Also, the foods that they had were tended to be lower on the glycemic index. Soy was also a factor in that, interestingly, when the women had half a serving of soy or more per day, that was one of the factors that was associated with better success.
With
And
soy,
also
sorry? Soy?
soy. Mhm.
Oh,
Mhm.
okay.
Soy, like tofu, edamame, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also that protein type was also an important thing too, right? So, I guess meat versus like plant-based versus fish and so on. Should I go through like sort of the hierarchy, or is that too much detail? Video, what do you think? Is that too much detail to hop
Protein,
into?
like
No,
the
we want
protein
it. Give us
Yeah.
the information.
Want it? Okay. All
Give
right.
it.
So if you think of protein really intake as a pyramid, right? And with the base of it, kind of like that old Canada food guide, with the base of it is what you want most of, and the top of the pyramid, what you want to have the least of. So the base of it, they found was should be plant-based protein.
Okay.
And this is maybe where soy comes in, so your legumes, your beans, chickpeas, nuts, that kind of thing, nuts, seeds, yeah. And so that's kind of what you want your base, your foundation to be. Next best is fish and seafood, I guess. And I think it's, that's probably primarily because of the omega-3 content in that. So a lot of healthy oils there. And then next best would be chicken, like your poultry. And then at the top of the pyramid, the one that you're having the least of, that would be red meat. And then processed meats like hot dogs and sausages and so on, like off the pyramid.
They're not even on the triangle.
Not even on the triangle, yeah. And they kind of did things like, interestingly, like when they did their calculations, like when they substituted, a serving of plant-based protein, if they swapped it out for a serving of red meat, for example, then the association with success went from positive to negative, right? Again, these are based on calculations that they had after they sort of congregated all the data. So
does that include, like, when you talk about what doesn't even make the pyramid, does that include like deli meats and yep. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
And we have some evidence to show that those kinds of meats generally are bad for sperm too.
Okay.
And like overall health, when you're looking at incidence of colon cancer and things like that. And that's not to say that there can't be some moderation in a person's diet, and we can talk about those factors with each individual, because our goal is never to be like extremely restrictive with patients. We know that going through the process of infertility is hard enough, and regulating your diet to like a certain level of perfection is just an added stress. But we talk about these things and how to apply them to each individual.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Sana, but it's important to remember that these studies were about dietary patterns and not dietary perfection. So it wasn't like, oh, did that person ever have a hot dog like during the study, right? Or like, so it's not about that at all, because definitely aiming for perfection is just untenable.
Yeah.
Nobody can do it, right? So I think that's just an important thing for people to remember as well.
Yeah. So the like, to apply it to your life, it's more about dietary tweaks rather than a dietary overhaul.
Totally.
Right. Exactly. And we also get a lot of questions from our patients about, sort of what specific foods people should or shouldn't eat. And
which I can get into for sure. But I wonder, feel free if there's any questions about this particular study or anything that we've said so far, feel free to just shout them out. Alan, do you have any this was quite a large study, and it was conducted over a period of 10 years with quite a lot of individuals, mostly women, right?
Yeah, I think it was well, I mean, it was about, I think 400 women or individuals with ovaries and uterus, and it was about, I think about 600 or 700, no, more IVF cycles in total. So this, it's not the largest study that you could do, but it's actually pretty big. And it took a long time for them to do it. And the other thing too is they based it on a lot of prior knowledge that they got from other observational studies. Like, for example, the Nurses' Health Study which was like, hundreds of thousands
Yeah,
of
like
people.
nearly 20,000 nurses.
Yeah.
Well, the
It was a
nurses
lot.
health study cohort was larger, but when they looked at the data on infertility, it was about 20,000 nurses. Yeah.
But over like almost 10 years, I think. So again, I think there's a large sort of pool of observational data that they were drawing from in order to kind of come up with their hypothesis, which ended up being true.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the diet, you mentioned that there are similarities to the Mediterranean diet, but that it's, which is like the Mediterranean diet is a bit more commonly known, I would imagine, in the general population. So what are the main differences between the pro-fertility diet and the Mediterranean diet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are
So
like
the extra folic,
yeah.
just to summarize, like the extra folic acid, B12, and vitamin D through food or supplement sources, right?
Yeah.
A lower glycemic index diet, consumption of soy, and good quality proteins.
Okay, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, Zainab, you said you were willing to dive into what the goods are and what maybe the not so greats are. Do you want to head in that direction?
Can I just add one thing that I forgot too, is that one factor was the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. So the Dirty Dozen, so a lot of you may know this already, but the Dirty Dozen list is the 12 produce items that have the most sort of pesticides on them, and the Clean 15 is the opposite. And so they found that when women had more foods that matched that Dirty Dozen list, it knocked down their likelihood of, there's this chances of success. Like it was associated with the lower chances of success.
Okay, is that only if they weren't eating organic, or does that matter?
Yeah, that's a very good question. They actually didn't study that, so they didn't tease out, whether the women are doing organic or not. But if you look at the foods that are on that list, the Dirty Dozen list, there's a lot of really good, healthy foods that have a lot of antioxidants, like blueberries, strawberries, apples, like those kinds of things. And so we know that antioxidants can be are helpful. She's
I love it.
Throwing different foods in my ear. These are the kind of whisperings I get with videos.
Tomatoes.
Yeah, so they didn't say, okay, well, what if you only had organic? Like, so that would be a nice follow-up to that study, would be to say, okay, if they had those foods and they were organic, did we see that same association? But more than one study has shown an association with foods with like higher pesticide levels with
produce
with lower fertility success
with IVF.
Okay, you mentioned the Clean 15. So I honestly, this is gonna make me sound dumb, so sorry world. But I really thought that the Clean 15 was just like a branded thing from Good Food because it's part of their menu that you could order from. So I really thought it was just like a Good Food thing, but apparently it's more broadly known than that. So can you, what are the Clean 15? What am I eating when I order from that part of the menu from a Good Food box?
Yeah, so my impression that with that Good Food, it's Good Food, it's like the Clean 15 is more like balanced low carb meals. So they're kind of using that Clean 15, I don't know, in that way. That's not really how I'm used to like hearing it.
Okay.
But Clean 15 so there's this group out of the US called the Environmental Working Group, and they basically look at the agricultural data. This is getting like really technical, but they look at the agricultural data and look at the foods that have the produce items that have the most pesticides, and the 12 top ones, the dozen, and then they look at the 15 items that have the least amount of pesticides, which are the Clean 15. And so those are like avocados, corn, pineapple, usually things with a lot of like a thick shell or rind or whatever you want to call it.
Casing.
Casing. But there are things like eggplant, asparagus, cauliflower, broccoli. Like there's a lot of things that you don't actually need to buy in organic form to reduce your pesticide exposure.
Mhm.
Of course, the things that are the most expensive to buy organic tend to be the ones that are on the dirty dozen list, the ones you want to buy organic, like
Yeah.
cucumbers. Like we don't even buy organic cucumbers because those cost a fortune, or like, you know,
Yeah, but one way
strawberries
one
and
way you can
such.
kind of get around that too, though, is like getting those organic versions but frozen, you know.
Oh.
And so like, you know, let's say frozen blueberries. Of course, they don't, like, the texture is going to be a little bit different, but because frozen still maintains, like, by and large, it's like nutritional value.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that way you can get these foods organic when they're out of season, and like it's going to be less expensive than getting them fresh and so on. So that's something that, you know, some of these you can do.
That's true. Organic blueberries and strawberries are definitely doable compared to like the fresh versions.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So
good tip. Great tip.
Yeah. Right. So the questions we get a lot of for like the types of foods, and feel free for other people, if there's any people watching who want to like shout out questions about specific foods. You know, gluten, dairy, alcohol, caffeine, I would say are like the top 4. And I don't have to go through all of them, but basically when you look, I just want to kind of briefly go through like the literature and what we kind of advise patients on those 4 topics. The first one being gluten, and it's quite a hot topic. I find, would you agree, Vidya?
Oh, definitely. And I have a polycystic ovarian syndrome, so it's an even a hotter topic, I believe, for that population.
Yeah, and dairy too. So, you know, with gluten, like eliminating some of these things like gluten and dairy can have a significant impact on your like social life and your life in general, social life when we had social lives. But, you know, really we want to look at the data and see if they have a significant impact on fertility before we make significant changes in our dietary patterns. Gluten is a little bit complex because certainly if somebody has like an untreated celiac disease, which I've come across a few times in my practice, they can have symptoms outside of the gastrointestinal system, and that can manifest like as infertility, but that's really, really rare. And there is like kind of conflicting evidence on whether or not undiagnosed celiac disease is more common in patients with things like unexplained infertility. So some studies say yes, and some studies say no. So definitely if a person has celiac disease, eliminating gluten is beneficial. And if a person also has like a gluten intolerance, you know, it may be beneficial. But on the whole, eliminating gluten really serves very little therapeutic benefit in patients who are struggling to conceive. And so we often, you know, we advocate for like a variety of whole grains in people's diets, and you know, the least processed the better, but we don't necessarily recommend people avoid gluten unless they're having like specific reactions or symptoms. And a similar thing can be said for dairy. You know, some people do react to dairy, like quite a few, I'd say more people react to dairy than they react to gluten. And, you know, dairy can cause acne at times and have other kind of issues. But the majority of the data on dairy and infertility really shows very little association between the ability to get pregnant and dairy consumption. And it's kind of complicated because there's so many kinds of dairy, right? And there's like varying degrees of fat levels in dairy. And, you know, back to the nurses' health study, we could see that in that study, patients who they broke down dairy consumption into like different degrees of fat content, and people who consumed higher intake of full fat dairy foods had a decreased risk of ovulatory issues, so ovulatory infertility and infertility in general. And other studies on IVF showed like no impact of dairy. So unless it really bothers you or causes acne or causes digestive issues, we don't necessarily recommend eliminating dairy, especially because it can be a really good source of, you know, protein. Fats.
Yeah. So a quick note on that one too is just interestingly, for individuals with sperm, it was found, most of the studies find sort of the opposite, where if they're going to have dairy, low-fat dairy seem to be the more beneficial one versus full-fat dairy.
Oh, really? Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure why, and I don't think the studies are huge, so we're not putting a big amount of stock into it. I don't think we talk up like sort of couples where there's ovaries and sperm in that couple that for them to buy two separate sets of dairy, right? I'm not at that point yet.
We don't have that kind of room in our fridge.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody does. We are getting some questions coming in.
Okay.
Do you want me to flip to those? Okay.
Yeah.
There's a question about hemp seeds. They've read about buying organic, but are not sure if they're heavily sprayed, and just basically wondering if there's a need to buy organic with hemp seeds.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Good question.
Do you know?
I don't know the exact answer to that, because I don't know whether they would fall into they would rank that in the produce, type of thing. The one thing I might say is, I don't know, maybe there's more oils in there, so maybe it hangs on to things a little bit more, but I wouldn't super concern me.
I wouldn't be super concerned either. I think, we don't really, nuts and seeds we advocate for patients to eat lots and lots of nuts and seeds daily, and there's quite some solid evidence on that. And we don't necessarily advise that they need to be organic, because they're so expensive already as it is.
Yeah.
And it's quite almost untenable to buy those things organic.
Yeah. It's hard to do everything that way.
Yeah.
In an ideal world, I think, it'd be great if everybody could do everything organic, but I think that's just not realistic or feasible for most people.
And it speaks to a broader question about, like, are you still going to get the benefits of that food if you consume it, in a non-organic way? And I think that, yes, I think that the benefits of hemp seeds will outweigh the potential harms if you are consuming it not organic.
Yeah.
Great. The questions are rolling in, so we're going to rapid fire these, if that's okay.
We'll rapid fire the answers.
There's a question from Lily. Hi, Lily. It's Lily, Zainab.
Lily.
Lily.
What are your thoughts on supplemental items to diets like hemp seeds, flaxseed, etc.?
Yeah, we're big on those, especially flaxseed, and there's some interesting data around the benefits of flaxseed. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. What types of fish do you recommend other than salmon and cod?
Yeah, so we recommend fish on kind of like a continuum, the ones with the most fat and the least amount of contaminants. So those that fall in kind of like that quadrant.
It's like the deep cold water fish.
Cold water fish. So
like
salmon, you mentioned, sardines,
mackerel, anchovies, herring.
Yeah.
Those are typically those ones.
You're not naming any of the fish that I enjoy, apparently.
What do you enjoy? Start with that and we'll tell you.
Luckily, I'm not trying to conceive anymore, so I can just eat my warm water fish or whatever it's called. Would a vegetarian lifestyle be preferred to an omnivore diet? That's a great question.
Sorry, can I go back to the fish question? I will say there are really good resources. So Health Canada and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has a list. So you can go on the websites and look, or See Choice. Like, there's these organizations that rank fish in terms of like toxin exposure. See Choice is one of them. And so that's a good resource to check in terms of the best fish to consume.
Yeah, there's a few sites that have like a sort of matrix of like the highest omega-3s and by like sort of the lowest contaminants kind of thing.
Okay. Where does shellfish come in?
Shellfish is quite surprisingly like low on the toxin exposure, and it's not bad. It's on the list of Health Canada recommended fish.
Yeah, and in that study that we talked about out of Harvard, they included like seafood, like shellfish, as part of like a sort of the fish group.
Interestingly, though, like a lot of in Lake Ontario should probably be avoided.
Oh.
Sorry.
Yeah, there's your warm water fish.
Yeah. Sorry, the question was about the vegetarian diet, right? Yeah, I mean, I think that there is some value to having things like fish, I would say, so if they could incorporate fish and get those omega-3s, There is some conversion of some of the sort of plant-based like omega-6s to omega conversion, but it's pretty inefficient in humans. So yeah, I think at the very least, adding fish should be a valuable thing.
But a vegetarian diet can, in and of itself, can be really healthy, of course. Just harder to get the balance of macronutrients like proteins, carbs, and fats. So we just like make sure we work with individuals to make sure they're getting that balance. But like as we said, like a focus on plant-based proteins can be a really like good source of protein for trying to conceive.
Yeah, and also we don't mean to say things like the red meat is not like an evil thing, kind of, but I think it's just one, because you are getting more B12 and more iron, from red meat. But I think it's just one that it seems like the studies are showing we should have a bit more moderation.
Right. There's a question here about what proteins are recommended for people who don't like fish, but Jamie, hi Jamie. We covered that earlier on. So I recommend just kind of zipping back because they talked about this great protein triangle that I never heard of before. So definitely pop back to the beginning and check that out. I'm only doing this because we're running out of time, so I'm trying to be as efficient as possible. What foods do you recommend to eat and avoid after a frozen embryo transfer? And what should you eat or avoid during the first trimester to prevent miscarriage?
That's a good question. The frozen embryo transfer question, I mean, we don't really divert too far from the recommendations we make like leading up to the transfer. All of those things are good, with respect to like the pineapple core and the pomegranate, there's no harm to eating those foods. There's no documented benefits, but I think it gives us all sense of reassurance when we like engage in some rituals to help us feel, like we have some agency over our transfers.
And first trimester,
Right.
I can think of, so caffeine is interestingly one where I think that we have seen some data come out in the last year that makes us feel that in the trying to conceive time period, caffeine may not play a huge role, but
in moderation,
yeah. And in the first trimester, in pregnancy, I should say, that some inferences that even 100 milligrams of caffeine might increase your risk of complications, including miscarriage as one of them.
Yeah, and we don't necessarily tell all people who are in early pregnancy to stop drinking caffeine, but we have that conversation in like an informed way.
Yeah.
Because the data is so wishy-washy.
Yeah. I remember reading about decaf as a potential alternative, but there were concerns over decaffeinated coffee and tea as well. Do you have any information on that?
I mean, I think that there are potential concerns around the decaffeination process. And I think, especially with something like tea, or coffee, if you're just trying to get pregnant, we really strongly believe that having one caffeinated beverage is safe. In the early pregnancy, I mean, it's really hard to say.
Yeah, I mean, there's no data on that.
No data.
Yeah.
But yeah,
hard to say.
But it's something to think about for sure, because that process is not inert.
Yeah. We're out of time, which I'm sad about because this was such a great discussion. Are there any parting words you want to leave with people who are watching today?
Well, thank you all so much for your questions. I mean, it really goes to show that it was such an engaged community, and we're really happy to, be a part of it. I guess our philosophy is always like, we don't want to cause additional stress and harm by having people engage in like really extreme dietary measures. We think that, having some level of dietary freedom is really important in this process that's hard enough as it is, but applying the evidence in a way that's appropriate allows us that freedom, because we can do the things that we know are important and then kind of like forget about all the rest of it.
Yeah, I think it's just like we said before, it's not about perfection. You know, there's sort of enough guilt to go around, so that's the last thing that we would want to add to anybody's plate. So yeah, so just, you know, I think try to stick to the guidelines as best as you can, but know that it's not about perfection.
I love that message. I think that you're absolutely right. Everyone going through this process of trying to conceive is already so consumed with what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong. And are they taking their medication at the right time? And did they put the needle in correctly? And all of this stuff. And something as simple as food, which a lot of people turn to for comfort, becomes a stressor as well. So I love hearing your approach that it doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be, you know, you just need to do your best, try, and there are simple changes that can be made that don't completely impact or overhaul what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally.
Exactly. Well said.
So thank you both, Alan and Zainab, for being here today. It's day 3 of Canadian Infertility Awareness Week. Zainab used to be a volunteer with Fertility Matters, so she's always willing to come back and help the community. And hearing you both is so refreshing and exciting for the community. So thank you again for coming. For everyone who's watching, please check in tomorrow. We have great events throughout the whole week, so lots of stuff lined up. If you're new to the infertility community, or, you know, tried and tested, there's stuff for everyone. So please check back in on the Fertility Matters Facebook page, and just sign up for anything you're interested in, and feel free to reach out and ask questions and connect. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all for your hard work and your volunteer work for CIAW and Fertility Matters, Vidya.
Thank you. Okay, I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.